ECON 2302 students, this is Professor Lewis. I did not intend to do another video, not for the live classes anyway, but because I'm still doing these for my online courses, here I am again. This video is dealing with oligopoly, the market structure that actually dominates the U.S. economy. These are markets that have a few very large firms that produce the majority of the market output. You could have just a few big firms that produce like 95% of the market output, with a lot of little firms that take up the remaining 5%, or it could be just like 2 to 20 firms. They're all big. This structure here, though, is what we like to call the big businesses here in the United States. And the thing is, oligopoly works a little differently than the rest of the structures because of the fact that the presence of strategic behavior kind of changes things up a bit. Market MC just does not work for oligopoly, because if you were to raise or lower your prices to do the market MC, your competitors may follow the price reductions, which will make it no longer profit maximizing, or they may ignore them, which means your quantity of sales will drop because customers will go to the firms that did not raise their prices. And so market MC doesn't work as a strategy for this anymore, because there's these other big players. They all have market dominance, and it leads to some issues. So we're going to go to our slideshow. I'm going to share the screen here, and we're going to talk this thing through and talk a little bit of game theory as well. All right, so this is slideshow number 9A, called Oligopoly here. And we're going to start by talking about a little bit of game theory here. If you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, it deals with a very bad fictional account of John Nash, the economist who came up with the concept of a game theory box, which has been applied to management, marketing. It's been applied in sports. It's been applied in sociology and psychology. It has a lot of applications, but it started as an econ application. So let's start off with a very basic problem in game theory. Assume we have two professional thieves, we'll call them Abe and Ben, that are on a heist, but they accidentally ended up killing a security guard. These guys are thieves, they're not murderers, and this thing causes them to panic. And so the police arrest them, they segregate them, they grill them, and they are no way able to corroborate their stories and protect their team. Now, after going through the old third degree, the DA sends the reps to prisoners at the same time, opposite sides of the police station, and they're each offered the same deal. If you will say that your teammate caused the guard's death, you will go 3, but your teammate will get 20 years in a federal pound me in the Patootie prison. This deal is offered to both of them. They're also told it's a limited time offer, and you need to think about it. Now, here's the end result they're not aware of, especially if they haven't asked to talk to an attorney. If they both testify and they each testify, turn state's evidence on the other, they're going to end up both getting convicted. They'll both get 10 years hard time. However, if they both stay silent, again, talk to your lawyer first, know your rights, they'll probably get 5 years in a minimum security prison, which is much lighter duty. Of course, the DA is not going to tell them this. An attorney would know this. But again, they don't know this here. And right now, these guys are in a state of panic. It's like, we were there trying to steal diamonds, man. We weren't trying to kill anybody. It was an accident that Paul Blart had that air conditioning unit get knocked over on top of him, and he couldn't run away fast enough. And so we want to consider what are the possible outcomes. And what you need to understand is when each thief is trying to make their decision, they have to think about what the other person might likely do. Now, this is to give you a sense of how oligopolies are trying to set their prices here. Market MC doesn't work because an oligopolist has to consider, if I lower my price, will my competitors follow me and match my price? And if that's the case, I'm not going to necessarily get any more sales out of it. Or if I raise my price, will my competitors totally ignore it and I'm going to start getting undercutted and bleed customers? Or will they follow me too? And so here's the basic logic of the problem in terms of the two thieves. Abe has two choices, remain silent or talk. So does Ben, remain silent or talk. Now these boxes here are showing the 4 possible outcomes that could happen. Abe and Ben both stay silent, 5 years minimum security. That would be probably the best outcome for both of them, where basically neither one of them would be made worse off by the other's actions. Now, if they both talk, they're both going to get 10 years in jail, hard time, in a prison where it's going to be much less hospitable to them. If one talks and the other remains silent, and notice we've got both options, where either Abe stays silent or Abe talks, Ben stays silent or Ben talks, one of them goes 3, the one that testifies, the other one gets 20 years here. Now, some people take a look at this and they say, well, that means the outcomes are equally likely. Oh, no, 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 no. We're dealing with a couple of criminals here, a couple of thieves who are very rashly self-interested. What each thief is trying to think about is, I know that if I basically roll on my boy, I'm going free. But is this person really my boy, or is this person going to roll on me? What's the best outcome for me? What's in it for me is the question they're asking. They're very rarely going to be thinking about what's best for both. This isn't like a street gang where basically snitches get stitches. This is a couple of professional thieves that essentially each person looks out for number one. So the thing is, a lot of people are thinking, they're both going to talk and get 10 years, or maybe they're both going to stay silent and get 5 years, or maybe one talks to just stay silent. Here's the reality. The end result is that 75% of the time, they both sing like the proverbial canary. They both get a middle-level sentence of 10 years in a hardcore prison. 20% of the time, one person talks, and the other one goes free. Only 5% of the time do they both stay silent. I find that so curious because that would have been the best for everybody involved. But you have to understand, each of them is going to talk because they're going to probably consider, hey, if I talk, I'm more likely to go free. And if the other guy talks, well, we both get the same fate. Okay, equally bad off. Let me add that as well. And so if you can kind of understand here, part of the decision process is what do I think that the other party is going to do and how that influences my decision. You can understand that if an oligopolist is trying to decide about pricing strategy, they have to consider the reaction of the other businesses. We call this the presence of mutual interdependence, that my action is going to cause a reaction from my competitors, and that when I consider my action, I have to consider their possible reactions. Now, oligopolies, because they're big, they have market dominance, gives them some price control already. And if they happen to produce a differentiated product or service, like say cell phones or cell phone services, they also get some price control from that as well. You can do market segmentation. This is a high-end product. This is a discount product. This is a middle-of-the-road product. But even amongst those, though, you still have to consider this kind of stuff. And this characteristic, the presence of strategic behavior, makes oligopoly different from all the other structures. Now, oligopolies don't start off as oligopolies. In the United States, we have had two possibilities lead to oligopolies. One of them was we have a monopoly. But what happens is over the super long run, which is like many decades for most industries, the technological base changes and the market changes to where the cost structure allows more than one firm to be supported. And so what ends up happening is a monopoly breaks up over time because of new competitors in the market. And so it becomes an oligopoly. And sometimes the government has to intervene to break it up. Let me add that as well. That happened with our long distance and local telephone services in 1983, when a couple of companies with fiber optic networks discovered they could carry long distance calls. They filed a lawsuit, antitrust lawsuit. The Supreme Court sided with the plaintiffs. AT&T was forced to sell off some of its assets, and we ended up with three companies instead of just one. Now, the other possibility is that we start off with monopolistic competition. And what happens is over time, mergers and acquisitions shrink the number of businesses to just a few big ones or create just a few that dominate the market. Class, we used to have like about 60 regional cell phone companies, and we're now down to 4 big dominant ones. We used to have about 30 different regional automobile companies across the country, but they acquired and consolidated. And now, even with the imports, we have about 12 companies that make most of the cars on the planet. So consolidation and leaving an oligopoly, just a few left standing is the way it goes. The airline industry also worked this way as well. Now, firms merge and get bigger because of synergies of production. We have economies of scale that can show up, financial economies, operating economies, and combined revenue enhancements. You've also got economies of scope, which is where when businesses get involved producing different products than they already do, things they learn producing the different product helps them with their cost of production of the products they produce initially. Like when Apple began making cell phones, stuff they made making cell phones helped them design tablet PCs and laptop PCs and desktop PCs that worked better. Sometimes what happens is when you combine two businesses, you can lay off a portion of the staff because you don't need 2 customer service departments. You don't need 2 revenue departments. You don't need 2 marketing departments. Sometimes what happens is one company is short of cash. The other one has a lot of cash, and combining them will straighten out the books for the cash poor company. Sometimes it's just a good value to buy out a competitor to merge. Sometimes when you merge, you get a greater geographic penetration. When JP Morgan Chase acquired WAMU, Washington Mutual, they went from having branches in about 7 states to having branches in over 20 states. And they didn't have a branch presence on the West Coast. That changed when they acquired Washington Mutual. Sometimes what ends up happening is two companies combine because one of them is the target of an acquisition, hostile takeover. It can prevent that from happening. And sometimes they combine for the sake of strengthening their political or economic influence. The ultimate thing with oligopoly is that collusion is very tempting because if firms collude, which means they work together for their mutual benefit, they share information rather than compete, they get to screw over the consumer and they get to be more profitable. The thing is, this kind of behavior is illegal in the United States. It's one of a list of practices that are violations of several federal antitrust laws that are on the books. We see collusion happen outside the United States. In some countries, the government has no problem when big businesses collude, and sometimes the government is involved in it, I might add. But the thing is, in the United States, because it is illegal, firms may collude on the down low. But if collusion isn't present, the firm's every man for himself approach will lead to a different outcome than when the firms actually compete with each other. I also want to mention that there's a bunch of federal laws that formulate the antitrust policy, and this is primarily applied to monopoly and oligopoly. But occasionally you have these rare small market settings like 2 gas stations in a remote town in Arizona once were prosecuted under these laws because they both raised the price of gas to like $7 a gallon, and the nearest next gas station was nearly 100 miles away, which was putting the public at risk. And so what ended up happening was both of the owners were forced to sell the gas stations to the corporations for the gas that provided them. And those corporations basically were under the federal scrutiny. And so those gas stations now offer prices that are based upon proper costs and get checked every now and again. But the Sherman Act of 1890, the Clayton Act of 1914 are the major laws that govern this. They prohibit businesses from making agreements with each other, conspiring with each other, or forming some kind of a economic trust that would restrain free trade, and it actually makes them a crime. And the federal courts are the ones that usually rule on this. The Department of Justice is typically the initiator in those cases. Sometimes it could be competitors against the colluders, I might add. But if we take a look at actual behavior, the Supreme Court has essentially consistently followed a pattern of they're going to jump on any companies that are going to engage in behavior that they feel will hurt the consumer. There's no doubt about it, it's harmful. But if they think that it has the possibility to be harmful but is not likely to, they may allow the actions to continue. And so this has led to some different results. They allowed, for example, United and Continental to merge a few years ago because United was nearly bankrupt. It would have cost a lot more jobs, and this was during a bad recession. But they also warned the combined company that the Department of Justice would have a lot of free rein to jump on them in a regulatory fashion if they started acting up, and a few times they have since the merger. But the flip side was AT&T tried to acquire T-Mobile, which the customers and then that company didn't want. And the Department of Justice threatened AT&T with an antitrust suit if they proceeded. AT&T did a cost-benefit analysis and thought even though we may win against the Department of Justice, it'll cost too much money and it won't be worth the trouble, so we're not going to pursue this avenue of business. And so again, different actions for different situations based upon what will do the least or the most amount of harm. These other laws you can read on your own. That's why you have the slideshows, but these have shaped some of this policy over the decades since the Sherman Act. A couple of major oligopolies to know about: search engines, wireless telecommunications, satellite television, soda pop, toilet paper, light bulbs, tires, household appliances, automobile, airlines before. These are all examples of industries that are dominant firm oligopolies because of a high concentration of the largest 4 firms. Now let's get to the models. Mutual interdependence. I don't call it kink demand curve because that model's been debunked, but many textbooks should still show it. This is a competitive, not a collusive oligopoly. I always frame it as you got 3 different businesses, A, B, and C, that compete with each other. They don't share information. No collusion goes on. The behavior that's observed is if one business raises price, unless the other 2 businesses happen to, by coincidence, raise their prices simultaneously, they're going to actually ignore that price increase. And in fact, if they were planning to increase their prices, they'll decide not to because they can start to say, hey, firm A raised the price, but we're still cheaper. And they can start bleeding firm A of customers. But the flip side is if one firm, let's just say firm A, lowers their price, as soon as firm B and C find out, because they have no advanced knowledge of it, they're going to cut their prices to match firm A's as fast as possible. Because if firm A says, hey, we lowered our prices, but B and C have it, they're going to start bleeding B and C of customers. And what's kind of amusing here is that if firm A raises their price and B and C ignore it, what ends up happening is firm A is going to end up losing revenue. And if firm A lowers their price and B and C follows, then all 3 firms lose revenue. It's kind of like Hobbes's choice. You're darned if you do, you're darned if you don't. Now, I have this kink demand curve here, but notice the big circle slash. It's not valid. You do not have a split personality demand curve and a discontinuous MR curve. What has been proven in the realm of competitive oligopolies is that their short-run graphs look a bit more like monopolistic competition. The graph may be a little steeper, but it's not past the 45-degree angle on the angle of descent here. The issue here is that their demand tends to be more price elastic, and prices tend to either, keep pace with inflation, or they're steady, or they even drop over time. Okay, and that's the reality here. Firms that compete have demand more like monopolistic competition. Firms that collude have demand more like a pure monopoly. So this model, ixnay, no way. The outcomes for mutual interdependence: prices either keep pace with inflation or drop over time. Firms will tend to earn small, long-run economic profits or normal profits in the long run. Remember, I said most businesses earn normal profits. Firms will maintain their relative shares. If I have 3 businesses in an oligopoly, one is at 65%, one is at 25%, one is at 10%. 10 years down the road, you could have them at 62%, 27%, and 12%. Okay, the issue here in hand is that they're going to maintain relative shares. The biggest ones remain the biggest, the smallest ones remain the smallest, the ones in the middle remain in the middle. And cell phone services, wireless telephone services, fits the description nicely. Now, a cartel is what we call overt collusion. It's a formal arrangement among firms in an oligopoly to share information and to set production and pricing in order to maximize profits for the group. The strategy is simple. Let's act like we're a monopoly, but let's not merge and become one. Let's maintain our autonomy. It's called overt with an O, collusion, because everybody knows it's happening. There's formal agreements, there's treaties, there's contracts. Everybody's aware of it. They just can't do anything about it. I want to emphasize cartels are illegal inside U.S. borders, and you see them operating outside the United States. OPEC is a cartel, for example. Also in the underground economy for stuff like cocaine, the Cosa Nostra was the infamous cocaine cartel that operated productions, distribution, and sale from coca leaf plantations in Colombia, on the roads through Latin America and Mexico, to the people dealing in all places around the United States. How the cartel operates is everybody shares information about costs, customers, marketing, revenue, etc. Stuff that relates to demand, the cost curves, and the marginal revenue curves. The cartel hires economists and statisticians and business people to construct a set of curves for them. And what they determine here is a quota quantity, or quantity that the group needs to do as a whole, CR for cartel. And they want to basically determine this output that would hit a price that's near the pure monopoly price. What's going to happen here is this. That Q star for the cartel is actually much smaller than Q star would be for an equilibrium quantity when the firms compete. So what they end up doing is they make the product more scarce and drive the prices up. But because of their collusion, their demand is more price inelastic, like a monopoly. And by restricting production and driving prices higher, they end up being more profitable, like a pure monopoly might be. But this Q star sub CR presents a possible problem. You see, you don't have a group of equally sized businesses with equal costs. You've got some that are very big, some that are in the middle, some are small. Some have much higher average cost of production. Some have much lower ones. And you have to understand that Q star for the CR is divided up in proportion to efficiency. Whoever can produce the highest output at the least cost gets the biggest share. Whoever produces at the highest average cost and has the smallest capacity gets the smallest share. The end result, though, is P star is going to be a lot higher than equilibrium price because of less output being produced. That pricing strategy I mentioned, the division strategy, is to make sure the group profits are maximized, but the end result is some businesses may be in the Lando Calrissian position. That deal starts getting worse all the time for you Empire Strikes Back fans. The outcomes, as long as everybody's on the same page and everybody sticks to the plan, the group as a whole makes profits. But the problem is, remember those businesses that got that smaller quota for the Q star for the cartel? They may end up taking losses, and they're going to have an incentive to cheat, which means overproduce. And this ends up causing supply to shift right, which drives prices down. And when the larger businesses start to notice they're not hitting that price that they consider to be the strike price, they're going to start following the money, and they'll figure out the smaller businesses were doing something wrong. This could start to lead to disagreement. The cartel could break up and become a competitive oligopoly, which is good for the consumer. However, Sometimes what happens is because the big businesses are aware of the situation for the smaller ones, they crunch the numbers and they realize they can make some concessions to let the smaller size businesses produce more. If they're still going to be more profitable with the cartel than not, they'll make these concessions to placate the small businesses so the cartel works very well. Recessions will often break up cartels, at least temporarily, because the lack of demand causes the whole arrangement to break down. I've been describing some behavior that has happened in the OPEC cartel in the last few decades. Now, price leadership, the tacit or quiet or hidden collusion, is what has happened in the United States. We've actually prosecuted the tobacco industry and the airline industry for doing this in the past. I want you to notice there's no formal agreements or documentation. And in fact, they avoid documentation because that's stuff that would hold up as evidence in a court of law. We have an unspoken understanding or an agreement here that one firm, usually the biggest or most profitable, is the leader, and everybody plays a game of follow the leader. They even develop a system of clandestine signals like spies. Emails were traded back and forth between a couple of airlines where they talked about golf games, 7 under par, 5 over par, at par. 7 under par was actually a signal, which meant cut prices 7%. 5 over par meant raise prices 5%, and we played at par meant hold the line, don't change your prices. The whole thing is an average individual who saw these emails would essentially be at a loss because they wouldn't have the codex to translate that secret message. They'd think it's a couple of boring executives talking about their stupid golf game on the weekend. But the thing is, since everybody follows a leader, prices tend to rise faster than they should, at least according to how some people might reason it, especially faster than rates of inflation, to use a macro term. And these businesses will tend to earn long-run economic profits. And the reason why they can get away with it, plausible deniability. You know that rate of inflation is based on average prices, and different businesses have different rates of increase in their costs. And some businesses have no cost increases. Some businesses cost decrease. Well, our costs went up because we've been dealing with federal regulators. Our costs went up because we had to upgrade our safety equipment. Sounds reasonable. Exactly. They have a reasonable explanation for why it's happening, and it satisfies most people. This is a very difficult situation if you want to prosecute. You need to either find a weak link that will rat somebody out, okay, or you need to find some evidence that somebody let slip. And this happened with the airline industry and the tobacco industry. There were weak links. In one case, somebody in the tobacco industry testified against them, which broke the thing wide open. In the case of the airline industry, somebody goofed up, didn't destroy a bunch of documents. He crossed the wrong woman. She turned that into a federal judge when she found those documents. And suffice to say, the airlines were caught red-handed. The operations, it's covert with a C collusion. It's hidden. Public is unaware of it, or they think something fishy is going on, but they got no proof. It's an informal agreement among firms in an oligopoly to share their information discreetly. Everybody follows the understood price leader. The outcomes, if they stick to the plan, long-run economic profits, maintain relative size to the market. Every once in a while, somebody wants to make a leadership challenge, kind of like in a street gang. And what ends up happening is whoever stands on the side of the person there, or the firm that basically makes the challenge, or who's actually the current leader, will win. And usually the current leader always wins. What ends up happening is essentially if one firm gets too big for its britches, the leader and the other firm say, hey, let's all cut prices and not tell this other group. And what happens is all of a sudden that group finds itself like left out to hang out to dry, so to speak. And everybody starts undercutting them, and they end up nearly losing their shirts as a result of it. I want to emphasize, this is illegal. It's a violation of antitrust laws. It's a form of price fixing and predatory pricing, but it is very difficult to prosecute because there's no documentation of this arrangement. The cigarette manufacturers were caught. The airlines were caught. The car companies were never caught, but there was suspicion of it for many decades because of what had happened before. All right. So let's wrap this thing up here. This material is part of the subject of an essay. It is an essay question that will be on the Unit 2 test. You have to describe each of the 3 oligopoly market strategic behavior models: mutual interdependence, cartel, and price leadership. You need to talk about how do they work, which types of industries have seen these types of arrangements, and what are the outcomes. A lot of the writing is on the operations and the outcomes. Again, this is an essay. Bullet points are not going to work. Lists aren't going to work. Proper sentences and grammar. I wish you all success, and thank you very much for your time.